Christmas! Hello dudes, dudettes, duders, and everyone in between. If you're an insane person, I've finally found the camera just for you. It was designed from the ground up by insane people, for insane people, and there's nothing else like it on the market. This is the Konica AiBorg. It's a 35mm point and shoot camera built around a Konica 35 to 105mm zoom lens, a variation of which you're already familiar with from the film Jurassic Park. That's right, this lens was kit bashed into the night vision goggles that Tim wears. The wild thing is, this is the camera John Hammond absolutely would have had lying around. It's got the same spared no expense worldview, being packed with a lot of tech that even the engineers who built it don't seem to really understand, much less implement with any concept of real world applications. The only thing this camera has on Jurassic Park is that if it breaks down, it doesn't eat the tourists. But before we get into everything wrong with the camera, let's get into what it is and what it does right. The first thing you'll notice about the AiBorg is its design, unique to say the least. Everything about the shape is, wrong. Like the engineers had heard a description of a camera but had never actually seen one, and then just went hog wild. For example, that's not where the shutter button goes. It just isn't, or maybe it's intentional. The shape of the camera is specifically designed to bring your fingers down and out of the way of the flash and the autofocus, which brings us to the flash and the autofocus, and also in between the viewfinder, all of which are nothing if not interesting. The lens zooms independently from the viewfinder and the flash, but they all move in tandem. So as you zoom in, both the viewfinder and the flash zoom in as well. It's a lot of clever engineering packed into a fairly small device, but we are just getting started. The autofocus is even more interesting. The AiBorg gives you 5 points of focus that can also function as a spot meter. The autofocus uses 3 components to measure distance and focus accordingly. I'm assuming one is an infrared light that sends out a signal, and the 2 larger bits are sensors, one of which has a fingerprint on it that I'm assuming was placed unintentionally at the manufacture stage. Now, to get 5 discrete points of autofocus, the 2 sensors have to move in tandem to sample the image prior to shooting. So as you adjust the point of autofocus, you can see the sensors pivoting. It's a really funky design that captures the spirit of this camera and its place in history really well. This was made towards the end of an era of aggressive analog camera engineering. It was released in 1991, over a century after analog photography had been invented, and on the eve of the proliferation of consumer digital cameras. This autofocus system feels like design had run out of walls to push or ceilings to lift. Almost like the engineers had to do something or their jobs were at risk. Like bad design was better than no design. Scientists so consumed with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to ask if they should. You control zoom and focus with a joystick that fails in so many different directions that it's hard to nail down what doesn't work the most about it. Let's start with the build quality. It's a shoddy 4-direction rocker design that just feels off. Up and down controls the zoom, which doesn't sound like it should feel wrong, but every time I go to zoom, I want to use left and right. Joke's on me though, the left and right controls the autofocus reticle. But if you're shooting on a Konica AiBorg, you really should get used to counterintuitive design that is poorly implemented. And hey, speaking of counterintuitive design that is poorly implemented, on the back of the camera you have the interface to move through settings, functions, and menus, such as they are. To the left of the joystick is an array of tiny buttons that control all of the camera's settings. And there are a lot of settings, maybe more than they should have packed into a camera, that can only communicate its intentions through a system of cryptic glyphs that really aren't that hard to learn once you know the vowels. Things start out innocuous enough with the flash, which can be set to auto, on, or off. Also easy to understand is the control mode. You have 4 settings: single, continuous, 10-second, and 3-second. Single takes 1 shot at a time. Continuous will continue shooting as long as the button is depressed. 10 and 3-second modes are pretty self-explanatory. The shot pops off either 3 or 10 seconds after you push the shutter button. With the meat and potatoes covered, let's get into the icing, and this camera is almost all icing. Now, every button and setting on the AiBorg has an icon, and those icons make absolute perfect sense. But only if you already know what those icons mean. Button icons are on the back, and settings icons are represented on an LCD screen on top of the camera. The first button after the flash is a toggle that switches the camera between normal and custom functions. The first custom function is infinity focus. This is useful for your landscape shots and locks the lens at infinity, ignoring the autofocus function. Next is night mode. This allows for longer exposures, up to 6.4 seconds long, to capture shots at night. The cool thing about this is that you can still use the flash if you want, so you can have the subject in the foreground lit by the flash while the background is long exposure. Next up is portrait mode, which, you know what? I'm just going to read the manual as it's written. Figures at different distances can be photographed at about the same size. While this might not sound impressive at a glance, what they're trying to say is that the camera will automatically zoom to capture a bust shot. It is hard to imagine a scenario in which you'd want to zoom in, but would prefer analog AI from the early 90s to make the creative decisions for you. But hey, if that's the direction you're headed, this is definitely the camera for you. Fair warning though, we never got this function to work. The next one is really exciting for those of you wanting to take a picture of your high score in Tetris to send into Electronic Gaming Monthly. There is a TV mode that not only exposes for a cathode ray tube, but does so at more than 1/60th of a second to avoid scan lines showing up in your shot. Spectacular! Next is snow mode, which is sort of the inverse of night mode. Snow mode assumes an overly bright background and allows it to be a bit overexposed so faces can look normal. When this is turned off, the camera would compensate for the brightness and bring the overall image down, but not so in snow mode. So I guess that you can finally throw that GoPro in the garbage. The next function is the crown jewel of the Dipsy Doodle design that is the AiBorg. It's bouncing ball mode. What this does is assess a proper exposure and split it into 6 discrete shutter releases over the course of about 2 seconds. These are all on the same frame of film, so if used correctly, you can capture some interesting slices of motion in a single shot. If used incorrectly, though, the results are underwhelming artistically, if still technically interesting. For best results, you want the subject to be bright and the background to be dark. Clearly, this is something that you could do better in Photoshop or perhaps with a strobe light and a proper SLR camera, but this is the insane camera for insane people. Bouncing ball is actually my favorite feature on this camera, as it captures the scope of ambition on this bonkers little point and shoot. I don't take idiosyncrasies lightly, and there's a reason. Oddities give way to intellectual and artistic mutations, either by forcing the artist to approach a piece from an angle they previously hadn't considered, or by allowing the technical process to move forward in ways it couldn't otherwise. Mutations trigger evolution, and those evolutions allow art to survive in hostile environments. If you think I'm blowing the importance of a novelty function on a largely forgotten point-and-shoot camera, only released in Japan in the early 90s out of proportion, you know, you might be right. But if you believe that there's poetry everywhere and beauty in ambition, you might also be right. But enough waxing philosophical. Let's keep bashing through the settings or we will be here all night. Next up is spot mode. Spot mode exposes for a point in the frame instead of averaging the entire frame together. Along with spot mode, you also have settings for plus 1.5 and minus 1.5 exposure compensation, which is really lip service because there are no manual controls on this camera. There's also a multi-exposure mode, which is similar to bouncing ball mode, but you can set the number of shutter releases you want up to 40 impressions on a single frame. Variants on bouncing ball don't end there. You also have multi-exposure continuous, which allows you to take shot after shot of multi-exposure images. There is a remote port on the side, which means that theoretically you could impress 40 images on each frame 36 times on a standard roll of 36 exposures running continuously. That's 1,440 discrete pieces of information mashed together in an outdated format using a failed and forgotten point and shoot. Now, if that doesn't sound like a good time, I don't know what does. There's just one catch. If you're exposing a single frame of film 40 times, your environment is going to be incredibly dark. So dark, in fact, that the autofocus won't work and the camera is past the edge of what the aperture and shutter speed can handle. Despite the fact that this camera was specifically built for time slice experiments, it simply isn't able to do time slice experiments. Even 10 exposures on one frame were past what the camera could handle. So it's an interesting feature, if not a particularly useful one. TE, or time exposure mode, is no less ambitious and no more successful. This setting allows you to take long exposures from 1 second to about, hold on, let me check my notes, 100 hours. Now, the manual does suggest a bit of caution here, advising that you use a tripod or the 3-second timer if you're planning on a 4-day long exposure.
Good advice.
Finally, there's interval mode. This takes shots at regular intervals from 10 seconds straight through, hold on, let me check my notes again, 100 hours. So if you've been wanting to shoot a 36 frame time lapse on 35mm over the course of 3,600 hours, this is the camera for you. I mean, hey, what's 150 days for your 36 frame time lapse? If it doesn't turn out, you still have half a year left to finish your 1.5 second movie. Because this camera was released in the 90s, it also has the option to burn the date into the frame. Now, this feature might have diminished value for normies because it caps at December 31st, 2019, but any time turners out there can just point their adjunct pulse meter at their temporal flux crystal, do a Nega Pro controlled black fuel burn, and go back to 1999 and take photos of the premiere of The Matrix with accurate dates burnt into their images. Or, perhaps, even better, go back to 1998 and get a photo of the Wachowskis' faces when you tell them that our way and highway don't rhyme, and the rhythmic parody of that expression is why people use it. Now, I maintain that the line would have made sense coming from, the agents, as it would have indicated that they are programmed to understand the mechanics of language, but not the beauty of it. But really, switch. There isn't a character less appropriate for that line of dialogue. If there's one character in the entire series who communicates a sensitivity and care with the power of economic language, it's Switch. Why would you take that from them?
Not like this.
Back to the camera. That covers the technical functions of the device, but doesn't really address the question at the core of a camera review. Are the images it produces any good? The answer is an emphatic sure. The biggest problem with the Konica AiBorg is that it is nothing but bells and whistles. From a Pentax K1000 straight through to an Arri Alexa, when I'm operating a camera, I treat it like, a Pentax K1000. If I've got control over aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and focus, I can get the project across the finish line under pretty much any circumstances. The Konica AiBorg, though, doesn't let you control shutter speed, or aperture, or focus. Whatever setting or feature you're using, you are divorced from control over the image. The camera isn't trapped in here with you, you're trapped in here with the camera, and that really starts to wear on you if you're using it for studio shoots. That said, we've been taking it out every time stills aren't mission critical, and we've managed to get shots that we're really happy with, especially when it comes to BTS and casual snaps. Paired with a decent film stock, we've actually gotten some shots that have a really good vibe. It doesn't hurt that the camera obviously looks weird. In fact, this helps grab attention and gets people locked in pretty quickly for grouped shots, just because there's a single point of curiosity to focus on. That said, if you plan to shoot on the AiBorg regularly, assume that you're getting no fewer than 3 shots for anything important, because you never know what's coming out of this thing. And that is the AiBorg in a nutshell. Attention-grabbing, ambitious in its design, and very flawed. The Konica AiBorg gets a lot wrong. It has more weird ideas of what a point-and-shoot should be than successful ones. It is never the camera that we reach for first for mission-critical work, with its main crime being that it's too clever by half. Lots of interesting offbeat ideas, and none of them are implemented very well. But just because it doesn't have a place in our A-kit doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place in our hearts. The many and bizarre flaws of this camera are not a death sentence, and I find this being the first camera that I reach for when I'm shooting for fun. To call the camera imperfect cartoonishly undersells its shortcomings. But the proof is in the pudding for snapshots. When you bust this thing out, people come alive because of how odd the device is. Once you learn where the walls are on this camera, you can quickly lose track of everything it gets wrong and just have fun with what it gets right. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm really tired of the right answers. Let's talk about car design for a minute. Through complex simulations of airflow and rigorous testing over decades, manufacturers have found the optimal car body shape. As a child, it never occurred to me that a Maserati would be indistinguishable from a Mazda. But here we are. Just kidding, that was a Porsche and a Toyota. Here's the Maserati and the Mazda. Just kidding, that was a BMW and a Subaru. Here's the Maserati and the Mazda. Just kidding, that was a Stormtrooper helmet and a Kia. Here's the Maserati and the Mazda. The point I'm trying to make is that right answers aren't always right answers, because the actual right answer is growth and adaptation. By the time engineers brought the AiBorg to market, they'd been working on that analog camera project for over 100 years. Things get weird at the edge of maps that big, but there's a curiosity here that feels achingly absent from modern cameras. Sony has an offering at $100 intervals and with minuscule differences between each model. And that's just one manufacturer. The differences from brand to brand, model to model can be quantified, but it just ends up being a spreadsheet of resolutions, frame rates, and crop factor. This is a trend that has been made all the more frustrating because instead of technological creativity, the innovation seems largely to be happening in the marketing, not with actual camera design. As a producer, this has real-world consequences. A lot of the younger talent we work with are graduates of YouTube University. Now, even if 100% of what they watched was only educational, there's still a very low ceiling on how useful it is because filmmaking is a physical process, not a theoretical one. You can't hypothesize your way into a great piece of art. Please, don't worry, I am not sloppy with nostalgia for a bygone era of Laffy-Taffy point-and-shoot cameras that had almost no market penetration on release and have only faded past the horizon since then. This camera is not a shimmering totem of what was perfect and ruined by capitalistic ambitions, aggressive marketing, and a shift towards analytic engineering instead of creative design. It's a pretty crummy camera, if I'm being honest. That said, I do believe that shooting on bizarro pieces of kit is really useful for perspective and inspiration. The nicest thing I can say about the AiBorg is that there's a huge margin of error you have to assume going in. If ever there was a journey is the destination camera, this is it. But like I said, the right answer isn't always the right answer because the right answer is the process of experimentation, tactile discovery, and miscalculation. Modern digital cameras are incredible devices, consistently delivering image quality and shooting experiences light years ahead of what's on offer from something like the Konica AiBorg. But imperfections are what make art delicious. Also, old junk like this that nobody wants anymore anyway, it's way cheaper. Look, if you're into funky old weird stuff, you should consider subscribing to this channel. And once you've done that, please turn off YouTube and go take some mediocre shots that functionally get you across the finish line, but serve mostly as a reason to scratch your head at odd engineering decisions made by small teams decades ago. And celebrate the fact that their fingerprints are on every frame you shoot.